Hey there, everyone, and we are live. Welcome back to another Seattle Data Guy show. We have Danny back. If you don't remember, we had him on a while ago. I think it was like 2 months ago, but you're back, and we're going to be talking about data pipelines.
Hey, folks. I'm happy to be back.
Yeah. Just to get started, you can give a quick background because you've been in the data world for I think 10 years, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, but somewhere in that range.
Yeah, for sure. So, hi everyone. My name is Danny. I am a data engineer. I've been working in data for a decade now, as Ben said. I started while I was attending university back in Hungary, and ever since then I've been working both on the platform engineering side or the analytics side, at startups, enterprises, as a consultant. So yeah, I've been around and I've seen some things.
Yeah. Just starting off with data pipelines, I think it's interesting because when I started my career, it's not like anyone told me and pointed at something and said, "Hey, like that's a data pipeline," right? Like they're just like, "Hey, we just need you to automate something that gets data from point A to point B." So when did you kind of first learn about data pipelines as like a concept and feeling like that's like a thing that people do?
Yeah, so similarly, while I was studying computer science, I had no idea that data pipelines were a thing. But at my first job, I was met with a very old infrastructure of tens of on-premise SQL Server databases and a lot of Perl scripts that tried to execute SQL queries in order. I think that's the best description. It was not very effective and broke multiple times per day, but that's how I learned what a data pipeline is.
Yeah, that sounds oddly familiar. Like the first few, I think, data pipelines I saw were like PowerShell plus, again, some stored procedures on SQL Server that people were trying to run in a specific order. And in some cases, right, like maybe someone's got a cron job that runs and tries to run them all in the right order. Sometimes they run out of order because one's not completed before the next one. So
yeah, exactly. And then I started researching in my other roles. I was getting familiar with orchestration frameworks, and it was an enlightening experience that you don't have to use cron. You can do it a bit more efficiently as well.
Yeah, I think that's why so many people do have a certain, like they feel like they really enjoy Airflow in particular because that probably came around, or they probably started their career around that time. So they had a few years looking at these prior data pipeline situations. Like I remember having to create a whole table that would just be like what pipeline is running right now, so we know not to run the next one. Like it's like, okay, I got to create my own dependency management system essentially, which is not like a good dependency management system. It's just it does the job, right? Like it's not in the code. It's very, kind of haphazard, especially when you compare it. So yeah, when I saw Airflow, I was like, oh, this makes way more sense than what I'm trying to do on my side. So yeah, I think that's why a lot of people do like it. Sorry, go ahead.
I think every data engineer at one point in their career will try to either re-implement Airflow without knowing about Airflow, or they will try to implement Airflow and try to make it a better version of it. It's a canon event.
Yes, I think so. I think that's why I like to tell a lot of people. It's like a lot of people, if you try building your own data orchestration tool or data pipeline tool, eventually you start getting there because you start needing the same solutions that Airflow is trying to solve. And obviously we're trying to make it better, and there are a lot of solutions there, but it's just interesting watching because you'll come into, at this point, it feels like I've come into like dozens of companies and see what they built, and it's always interesting. Do you have any interesting stories about like a data pipeline solution you've seen that someone's kind of custom built?
I think one of the most popular ones that I've seen appear in many organizations is that they want to build like a declarative framework around Airflow, so like a configuration-driven data pipeline orchestration system. And for some reason, almost every data team that I've encountered think this is a logical next step when they start after they start using Airflow, that they want to do it from YAML files, for example, without having to write Python. And I don't know, like in 80% of the times or even more, it turns out to be like just as complicated. Like I understand the mission of making it more available for people who don't necessarily know Python, but writing YAML honestly can be just as complicated.
Yeah, I always feel like YAML has its place, and specifically around like configuration, but I've never been a YAML fan when it comes to something that's more code based. I think other than like Terraform, being very config heavy, I think in most cases it's like I just am gonna want to occasionally write my own scripts, and if I have to go somewhere and kind of almost be, it's like a worst middle ground. It's like either let me use a GUI and like let it be drag and drop, or let me code. But it like YAML to me is like a bad middle ground. But I know some people like the idea. So
yeah, I mean the YAML engineer term exists for a reason.
Yeah,
I think.
So in terms of like, as you've taken on a lot of data projects and led some, especially in your consulting experience, where do you start in terms of like building a data pipeline?
So I think the most important first step is starting with the business problem. Always, you have to take the time to understand what actual insights or operations your data pipeline will enable or will support in the organization that you're working in. So without these clear requirements, I've seen many pipelines either be super over-engineered or quickly become irrelevant after they were finished. So I think that's the most important. That's the most important step. If I start a new project, I usually just take the time to do the proper amount of research. Once you have that, you can start the architecting part. You have to map out all the data sources, all the destinations before you actually get to the middle part where you will implement the transformations. It's good to have like a dictionary of what data you can actually use, and what are the expectations on the other side. And once you have those, you can start filling in the blanks and think about like other features of a data pipeline as well, like governance or scalability for the future.
Yeah. In terms of data sources, have you come across any that were tricky to work with?
Yeah, I think every data engineer has a lot of war stories of crazy APIs that they encounter in the wild. I don't know which one was the wildest one. There was a lot of SOAP APIs that I had to wrestle with, but that's bad because it's old. I've seen a lot of hard to understand APIs that were just a few years old as well. They usually have the worst part is when they usually the backend developers decide that they want to roll their own authentication framework, and it's like this weird convoluted way to get like a token, and then I don't know, it's just usually a mess. So I think if I not only say this because I work at a company who builds a platform for data pipelines currently, but I think for most data engineers, it totally makes sense to look at managed options for data pipelines because it's just so hard to write an extraction script for some of these sources.
Yeah, some of them are pretty straightforward, right? Like obviously some can be, but there are always interesting ones. I think there's a few that I've run into. I don't know if they're still like this, but basically the way I like to describe it is like they developed the API for a software like connection. They didn't develop it for a data extraction. So you're like literally having to like ping it for every entity one at a time, because it's like, well, yeah, why else would you, how else would you use our API is kind of the way I could explain it. It's like, well, I would like to extract all your data, not just one row at a time, which I've had a few instances like that where it's painful and slow, and that's never my favorite.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What was I thinking? Oh yeah. in terms of like what's changed, because again, like when I started and when you started, you had Perl scripts, I had PowerShell. There was some SSIS, and SSIS is still very popular. But what do you think has changed in the last 10 years in data engineering pipeline? Sorry, go ahead.
One of the biggest things that I have noticed is the shift from batch processing pipelines to real-time pipelines. So now that the actual technologies or the vendors like S-Cherry, the way that they provide real-time pipelines, it became so accessible that I see a lot of organizations who previously would have said that, oh, it's too complicated for me and we don't need it, still take that leap of faith, and they're like, oh, okay, let's consider real-time first for this new data pipeline, because why not? It's obviously a competitive advantage, and it never hurts to get those insights faster instead of like a day or a week later. And the other shift, if we talk about the last decade, is how much more automated things are. Like there's so many data integration services now that automate away or like abstract away the infrastructure, so you don't have to run your own Spark cluster or Kafka cluster or any of those tools, which are notoriously hard to operate. You can just go to register on the website and set up a few connectors, and you have an ETL pipeline. And I think that's a very powerful change in the last few years. And
yeah. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, so I have one more in my mind, but please.
Please go. Please go.
Yeah. So the other one that I was thinking about is how data governance became a first-class citizen. Like in my experience, 10 years ago, nobody really cared that much about about data governance, except for some certain industries. But now, like the privacy laws and the compliance requirements, they became way more strict, rightfully, and the organizations can't really disregard them anymore, and they have to treat it as like a first class concern in every data pipeline.
Yeah, it's definitely like it's trying to figure out the right balance there, because I think in some cases, some companies are very much running towards trying to improve their data governance. I think some are just figuring out how to get data out of their SaaS solutions. So, that's not even a consideration as much as it should be. And then that's why occasionally you'll read an article about someone or some company that is maybe newer that has had a data leak, because they're a little less mature in that space.
Yeah, for sure.
I do think it's interesting. Like, we have a lot more tooling these days. You've probably seen the Mad Data landscape. It feels like it's endless tooling. In some ways, it's nice. I think sometimes like the whole like modern data stack kind of approach in like the 2020s. One of the things I thought was interesting there was, after using it for a little bit, I was like, well, what's funny is we somehow created this like a lot of piecemeal tools, and people are now coming around and trying to improve this, but we created a lot of piecemeal tools, which then created the same problem we had in the past, which was like, okay, we run one script at 12 midnight, we run the next script at 2, because at first a lot of them didn't talk to each other, or you'd have to like write code to wrap around them to talk to each other. So it was like, okay, oddly enough, we're having to orchestrate all this all over again. So I thought that was kind of interesting, right? Because like DBT wouldn't talk to Fivetran, so then you have to like get them to talk to each other one way or the other, or you'd have to get Airflow to orchestrate it all, which then it's like, well, could I just use Airflow instead? So like purely Airflow. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting part, like an interesting time that we are currently in terms of how the data stack is evolving. Obviously, the modern data stack became a thing for a reason. Like previously, those gigantic data monolith services just couldn't improve fast enough and couldn't evolve fast enough. So there was a need for like specialized services. So that gave birth to the mad landscape, as you mentioned, like thousands of smaller tools, which now have to be glued together somehow. That's another problem. But it is something that we have to deal with. And I'm curious what the next step will be in how the data stack evolves.
Yeah. The next question I have there is like, so I think what's also interesting with like, the whole MDS world is like it seemed to impact only certain companies. Whereas if you went to enterprise, that's not what you saw, right? Like at enterprise, you still saw a lot of tooling that maybe was either like Azure Data Factory, SSIS, traditional tools. I'm curious if you had a chance to kind of see any of that as you were kind of going through and either consulting or even your current experience.
Yeah, I think these larger enterprises are now getting to the point where they trust these newer tools enough to actually integrate them into their own data stacks. So they mostly had like these like Alteryx or Matillion, like these tools so ingrained into their data stack that it was almost impossible to even change like one component of it, because these smaller specialized tools, they didn't have enough features or enough enterprise support. But like us at SSIS see this firsthand, that we are getting more and more interest coming to us from like larger enterprises, either to supplement a new use case where they are like, okay, let's find a team that can move faster and can support our use case, and they are willing to integrate a new tool into their service or into their stack, or they are actually willing to migrate from one of these older behemoths. But yeah, I think it took them like they were like delayed by 5 years compared to the other organizations.
Yeah. In terms of like challenges you've seen when building data pipelines, because again, it feels like they should be pretty straightforward. We've been doing it now for probably multiple decades. Depending on when you want to start saying we were building data pipelines. So in that, like, what challenges have you kind of seen and have you run into?
Yeah, I've seen a few. I think one of the most common ones that probably comes to mind for every data engineer is data quality issues, and it's like inconsistent or missing data. If you're the data engineer writing a data pipeline, you usually do not have control over the upstream data sources. Essentially, what you see is what you get, and very often those upstream data sources change. They either change their schema, change their like data quality rules, or something changes that you have no control over, and it breaks everything. And that's one of the hardest things about building a data pipeline, because you can plan for it to some extent, but not to the whole extent of it. So you can't keep in mind all the scenarios for all the data quality issues or schema changes, and you have to just consider this trade-off that, okay, I'm willing to handle these, but if something like this happens, then the whole thing breaks, and we can wait for the upstream owners of the data source to actually implement a fix. I think this is number one, and maybe even number two. Like it's such a common issue.
Yeah, even at Facebook, right? Like we would just occasionally come in the next day and it'd be like, oh, my data pipeline's broke because someone on software engineering or in the application side changed something in their table and removed a column and it doesn't exist anymore, and now everything's broken. Or they changed the data type. Eventually, Facebook implemented something where their solution was it would just send you an email that would yell at you and be like, hey, you have a pipeline that you own that the source table has changed, so you better go check it out. Was kind of the solution, because it's hard. I think always the challenge is it's hard to get software engineers like incentivized. It's like, why would they want to like involve you and then slow down their work? Be like, hey, can you please check off that I can make this migration happen, right? Especially when you're basically getting rewarded for making changes and doing new things and making things happen on the software side. You're not going to really care on the data side. So it definitely happened.
I think that's a very important thing that you said, that these technical challenges, if you drill deep enough, become organizational challenges. And those are, in my experience, harder to deal with very often, There's no like silver bullet. Usually there's no solution that you can just copy paste from the internet, and it takes like just way longer to work on those.
Yeah. And what might work at one company doesn't work at another one, because it's like, well, it's a different organization, different culture, different way they want to operate at the end of the day. So
exactly. Yeah.
No, I always schema changes are always interesting. Like those are, they're just the ways they can happen are always interesting. They can happen in an API, they can happen in a database. I remember like, I've worked at a few companies and a few projects where like, you get SFTP files and they say, hey, this is the way the SFTP file will look. And you're like, great. And it's not going to change, right? And they're like, yeah, never. And then suddenly they change it like the next week. And you're like, what? We had a conversation. I thought we had a deal. Thought you weren't planning to change this anytime soon. So
exactly. And like data pipeline platforms like S3 Flow do their best to automate these schema evolutions as much as we can. Like I know for a fact that our team has been working on the schema evolution feature for like years now, continuously, and there's still like these random edge cases that come up every so often from a customer with like a new type or a new like weird schema property in some data source that we didn't expect, and it's just a never-ending battle to try to automate it away. Yeah.
No. In terms of projects that you've kind of taken in the past for data pipelines, can you talk through any of them and maybe some of the decisions you had to make as you were building them?
For sure. So I built a lot of data pipelines for a lot of projects. One of my favorite ones from the past years was when we were working for a client whose idea was to collect publicly available medical professional data from all across the US and do some magic on it and build their product on top of it and serve it to their customers. But so there's many states, many cities in the US, and many different providers of these publicly available data sets. And it was a very hard data pipeline architecture to figure out where can we use like pre-built connectors, where do we have to write our own connectors, what kind of infrastructure do we run the whole thing on, how do we implement in-flight transformations, how do we do entity resolution. So it was like a crazy data as a product project, but it was one of the most interesting ones that I worked on.
Yeah. And in that, I might have missed, what tools were you using?
So for this project, in the end, we went with pretty much custom Python code for all of the pipelines, which is something that I usually recommend against for other data engineers. But this is a good example when there's no other option. Like these data sources had to be web scraped. They were in weird PDF files that you couldn't really put into an ETL tool. So we had to write a lot of Python code. And in the end, we moved everything into a Snowflake data warehouse where we did the rest of the transformations.
Yeah. Did back then, did you have any favorite tools, or especially for like the data pipeline source?
Or
not data pipeline source, just like the data pipeline source.
Yeah, I was always a fan of real-time data pipelines, and I love to build anything with Kafka, for example. And when I discovered S3 Flow, where I work now, I realized that life can be easier than having to manage Kafka myself. And now I'm having a lot of fun just building like side projects for myself using S3, and I can just set up a little real-time pipeline. And it's great.
Nice. Just because this is kind of, I think it's somewhat in the same vein. How do you keep yourself up to date on new tools, methodologies, and frameworks in data engineering? So it can feel like there's a lot, but what do you do anything to keep up with it?
Yeah, for sure. That's a very good question. I try to be active in the data engineering and some data engineering communities. I am I read the data engineering subreddit every day. I follow a lot of data engineering people on LinkedIn. I am also in a bunch of Slack channels, which are more like data related in general, but there's usually a lot of good discussion going on there. And I also read a lot of blogs from companies who are very data heavy, and they have like great data organizations like Netflix or Facebook and Airbnb, and yeah, those guys.
Yeah. Do you, like when it comes to like reading some of those articles, especially from like Facebook and Netflix, I'm curious, do you ever feel like it, like, does it fit for the enterprise is kind of where I'm trying to go with, because sometimes it's like it's great for Facebook, but the question I always have is like, but does that work at other companies?
Yeah, rarely, I think, but I think it's important to understand what's out there, and one day you might be able to use it if you encounter a similar problem. I think a good example is when Netflix published their DB log paper or research like 5 years ago, maybe. Which was a new way to do change data capture and not put a lot of strain on the source data system and not block any process by like cleverly snapshotting. And that was something that a lot of companies started implementing themselves based on just the paper and that blog post, essentially, who were implementing like change data capture tools. So it happens that one of these big tech companies release something or just publish something that other people can actually use. So I think it's good to be up to date.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's just something I'm always thinking when it comes, because one of the benefits I will say about most things that I've either worked with or talked to people that work there is that, unlike enterprise, where it feels like you have 30 different data pipelines all across the company, none of them centralized, right? Like they're all running their own flavor of something or other. You know, working like at Facebook, for example, is like everyone's running the same data pipeline, like the same tooling. So it makes it very easy, right? Because you can easily switch teams. You can easily, it all interacts with each other. It's all very well integrated, which gives them a lot of advantages. So I'm always curious, like, well, could we ever get enterprise companies to be that way, where it's like, okay, we'll only ever use one data pipeline tool for the entire enterprise. We'll only ever use one data warehouse or one data storage layer. And then maybe you can pick whatever data warehouse you want on top of it. But yeah, I'm always curious to see what we'll have there.
Sure, you can do it. You just have to convince every stakeholder.
Yeah. No, not hard at all. Not hard at all. I do wonder, like, what Facebook and all those companies did differently. Like, is it just that they built it from the ground up, and so they had that opportunity to say, this is what we're going to use? Because what I imagine happens is, like, it's just that one VP is like, well, we're going to do the AI initiative, and then they want to get a promotion. So then another VP is like, well, I need to do an AI initiative too, and so then they start their own AI initiative, and it's just mostly a bunch of people in their own fiefdoms trying to just build something that they can say, look how cool and look what I delivered. But it doesn't help the company in the long run.
Yeah, so this is another example of technical challenges becoming organizational challenges, which become technical challenges again. So I think either like a decision has to come from top down, that okay, this is the only technology that we're going to use across the whole enterprise, and that's it, or you have to embrace it and choose tools that are easy to integrate with each other, which can also be a viable way.
Yeah, no, I like that. Going back to kind of building data pipelines, I think one of the issues that eventually you run into, right? Like you start off, you build some data pipelines, they work great. How do you approach when like you have scaling, right? Like you have data pipelines that your data is growing. How do you kind of start trying to deal with those problems?
Yeah, I think that's a very good problem to have in my experience, because it means that something is growing. Hopefully, the business is growing, and there's more data to deal with. So that's always good, and that's where the whole thing gets interesting, right? That's where the real challenges are if you start scaling. I usually I usually start researching the bottlenecks in a data pipeline, because it can be anywhere. And just because it starts to break, you don't necessarily know if the bottleneck is the ingestion layer or the transformation stage in the middle, or maybe even the destination where you're trying to actually materialize your data in. So I think just diving deep and figuring out where the issue is a good first step. And another thing that I usually recommend is switching to a streaming first architecture, because those systems usually handle data volume or scaling better, in my experience. Like some of these batch data processing frameworks or data pipelines often break if you give it like the double amount of data or triple, whereas streaming systems are built for like high scale or high volume environments. So it usually makes sense. But it's obviously not easy to just switch from one to another if you run into issues. So just keep in mind when you build something new. And and then you can go into the technical details of how you can implement incremental processing, partitioning. It depends on all the technologies that actually make up your data pipeline.
Yeah. I think scaling is always an interesting challenge, right? Like there's a lot of different things you can do. I remember one time at one company, the solution was just to change a pipeline from running batch to just running smaller batches. It was like, we'll just run it in smaller batches, then it won't break. So there's always like little steps you can take on that path. But like you said, like there's definitely some benefits in starting out.
And the easiest way, or the fastest you can process data is to actually skip it. So if you can identify stuff that you don't actually need, that doesn't provide value, then just drop it from the pipeline at the beginning, and suddenly you don't have scaling issues.
Yeah. It sounds like, is that something you've had to do in the past?
Yeah, sometimes it happened on multiple occasions that was the easiest solution. It turns out that we had a bunch of like garbage data going through the pipelines that we never actually used, and nobody knew why it was there. So we just excluded it from the beginning, and suddenly everything was right.
Yeah, that's funny. Kind of going to like people who are trying to learn, data engineering, data pipelines. How do you think people can learn about it today?
So I think there's two, maybe three things that you need. One is Python and SQL, and some understanding of data pipeline paradigms or architectural models. I think if you start learning these three and start building small projects, then that's probably the best way to dip your toes into data pipeline and data engineering as well. Like you can complicate it a lot, but at the core of a data pipeline, if you have a language or have a way to implement moving data from a system to another and implement transformations on it, then you have all the tools that you need to actually create data pipelines. So just start writing small Python scripts that get data from an API, save it somewhere, do some transformations, and then load it into some other system. There's a lot of free and open source stuff available that I think are perfect for smaller projects like this.
Yeah, are you talking about like data sets that you can kind of pull from?
There's a bunch of open source data sets as well. One of my favorites are on BigQuery. They have a lot of data sets available for free. Yeah. And BigQuery itself also offers like a free tier, I think, for if you stay under a certain data volume of data processed. So I think that's a great way to start. Just read some data from there, do some transformations, and load it somewhere else.
Yeah, no, I do like that BigQuery has that. Like, it makes me think of when I first started trying to do like data projects. I would have to like download SQL Server, download like get all that stuff, then try to insert it correctly, and then whatever data set I picked, like there'd be some problem with the CSV. There'd be, it wouldn't be double quoted or something, and then something would break the load, and then I'd have to figure out how to fix it. And now it's just like, oh, you can just go to BigQuery and like analyze data that they just have there for you. And it's like, what? You guys have to struggle. I'm sure other people had far harder challenges before, I'm sure people could say their challenges were worse, but back in my day, they're like, I had to build my own database back in my day. It's like, okay, well,
it's a little bit more complicated if you want to try out like a streaming system, for example. Like it's hard to find free data sources that actually provide live data that you can work with. But a good example is the Wikipedia actually has a free live stream that you can just plug into and start implementing like real-time transformations. Or Blue Sky, the new social media X replacement, also has a completely public and totally free fire hose API of all the data that it produces. That is also an interesting option. So you just have to find a data source that you think is interesting, and then just make up some weird project about it and get to coding.
Yeah. Is Flight Radar, is that data set streaming? I don't actually remember if that's streaming or not.
I think so, but I'm not sure if it's free.
Oh, yeah. That's the one thing is, I will say that's actually something I've been working on recently. Is trying to find data sets that are a little more real. So I've actually been working on, it's not streaming, but the streaming, like you said, it's hard to find streaming, but it's like the CMS data set, which is like a healthcare data set. Which they even made it to be essentially as real as can be, without giving away real people's information. They're like, look, we can't obviously make this real because we don't want to risk public health information or private health information, not public, private health. But yeah, so that it is always interesting trying to find good data sets to build projects on.
And I think if you like, if I can give like an example for streaming stuff, if you want like fake data that looks realistic, then there's also services for that, or tools like Shadow Traffic is a great example. It's essentially a streaming system that generates like completely realistic looking data, so it's perfect for simulating production traffic.
Yeah. Just because I think this is kind of an interesting question. Which method do you prefer, ETL or ELT, and why?
Yeah, that's a good question, and often a source of debate between data engineers. I personally think that both have their place in the data stack. I know that a lot of people think of ELT as like the next step in terms of evolution from ETL. But as someone working in the streaming data space, that's not true, because streaming data by nature is an ETL process, because you always have to transform before you actually load it into the target system. It never looks the same unless you're like replicating between two databases that are completely homogeneous. So I don't prefer either. For like batch analytics use cases, I always or not always, but I usually tend to go with ELT, like get the data as soon as possible into a cheap storage where you can slap some hardcore compute on top of it that actually is able to process historical data and everything else.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because like even with like ELT, I think some people have kind of pointed out that it really ends up being still kind of another version of ELT, LTT. You're gonna do so many more transforms on it that it'll catch up with you regardless. I do like the whole process of getting the data in somewhere so you can look at it and start building on it. But at some point, that one of I think the selling points of ELT was like it should be faster, right? Like you're going to develop faster. But the T still is there, and you're still going to have to spend time figuring out what you're supposed to transform. It's not like it's like, oh, you're not getting rid of that spot. So you're just changing the order. It's not necessarily a faster approach per se.
Exactly, and sometimes you're constrained by other requirements as well, and you have to do transformations more upstream or like in an ETL way. Like sometimes you have to do like data masking or hashing, like PII, private information before it actually lands in the data warehouse or in your data storage, and that inherently becomes an ETL process, because all of those, you have to do in flight.
Yeah. And I think you also caught out another one. It was on a project, but like another good example. I mean, this is not so much on ELT, ETL, but just like data projects. I was thinking is like scraping is just another good example. I think of trying to build your own projects as you're trying to figure out what to do, and making your own data sources. There's tons of data sources that you can just make. But that was just me thinking about that. So.
Yeah, data scraping is a lot of fun. I like building a lot of side projects that start with scraping some data from some website.
Yeah. Oh, someone asked about, I think, the website for simulating real traffic. What was that?
Oh, it was shadow traffic for real-time synthetic data sets.
Yeah. Is that just like basically supposed to mimic traffic from a website or something?
You can configure it however you want. Essentially, like you can start building like e-commerce data or financial data, or you can set up the schema as you want, multiple streams, relations between them. So it's like a proper production like data traffic, and essentially streamed to you, so you can do whatever you want with it.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Let's see. Oh, the next question, kind of a classic one. Where to go? Oh, here. Do you have any suggestions for shifting my career as a data analyst to a data engineer?
For sure, yeah. I see many people do it, so it is definitely possible still in today's job market. I think the most important thing to do is to start working yourself upstream in the data pipeline, in the data value chain, and see how the data that you use to analyze actually gets there, and just work your way back. Like if you're usually familiar with a BI tool, for example, then start looking into how the data gets there, what kind of data warehouse lives there, how the transformations are implemented there, and then how the data gets into the data warehouse itself. So just work your way back from what you currently know to get like a good overview of the whole data value chain. And as for technologies, I always recommend two things: Python and SQL. I think those two are pretty much all you need.
Yeah, I think that tends to be the biggest thing for most companies. I know some companies still use some other languages, but at most companies, you're probably going to use Python at this point. Occasionally, you're going to run into those Perl scripts or PowerShell. I've still seen a few companies using PowerShell, but if you understand Python, you'll probably understand most of the other things as well. Although PowerShell, I remember, like, it's still interesting seeing it. Usually, it just means that they're a Microsoft shop. It's like, okay, everything is integrated through PowerShell.
Yeah, PowerShell is like the definition of counterintuitive for me. Like when I used to write it, I was like, okay, so in my mind, I know how I should write this down. So I looked it up how it's done in PowerShell, and it's like the complete opposite. So that's how I always remember it.
Yeah. Well, now with ChatGPT, I'm sure people just say, hey, just write it for me. I know what I need to do. I have it in Python. How do I do this in PowerShell? Cool. So from a career standpoint, how do you view it? Is data engineering, do you still view it as a good career? I don't know about beginners. Beginners hard, but I'd still like to hear your thoughts there.
I think so. I think it's still one of the best in the tech space. I think it's not slowing down, and it's not going to slow down for the next decade or so. As long as there's data, I think there's going to be a need for data engineers. It's a very currently it's a very ambiguous role, I think, shifting between analytics and platform engineering. So there's still no definition for it. but I would say go for it. I can recommend it. And the latest AI boom to me kind of showed that you can't really automate away a data engineer's job yet.
Yeah. It's they've been trying to, I feel like, get rid of the data engineering job for a while. I remember I was talking to someone who they've been in the data world far longer than me, and they were talking about going to like the first whatever Microsoft conference or whatever that SSIS was announced, and they like their friends were there, and their friends were like, "Oh my gosh, my job is gone," right? Like they don't need me anymore. And if you've used SSIS, you know that's not true. It's like, oh great, now it's just something else I have to learn. Is the only thing you figured out there. So it's definitely, I think the harder thing is like beginner. We'd have to figure out like what beginner means, like how where your skill set. I think that's usually the challenge, is that data engineering tends to be such a broad field that you just have to know a lot, and so that's why it can sometimes be hard for a beginner. But usually I see a lot of people come from like data analytics and then push into data engineering or something of a similar space, right? Or if they have a software background, they'll often come from there.
Yeah.
Let's see. Hi, have you ever heard about DLT? So the open source kind of data pipeline tool. What do you think about it? Have you tested it out yet?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's great, and it fills a big gap in the toolset of data engineers, because before DLT, if you wanted to write like a custom pipeline, you had to either like use a tool that has a connector or some kind of framework, but usually they were not flexible enough for like custom data sources or data destinations, and it took a lot of effort to either make them work for your use case, or you had to start completely from scratch and write like a huge Python script for yourself. So I think DLT came in at the right time and in the right place. As a Python library, totally makes sense to provide primitives that you can use to build your own pipelines, and not more than that. So it's totally fine to be opinionated in how you read data from a REST endpoint and how you handle paging and stuff like that. But it gives you enough freedom in your own code to actually build a custom data pipeline. So I think it's great, and I definitely see a future for it for batch data pipelines. For streaming, not so much, but I think that's not the plan anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, I'm glad you've had a chance to test it out. Maybe it'll be in one of your future projects. Do you share your projects anywhere?
I mean, I do have a GitHub where I put a lot of these toy projects that I work on. I should probably clean it up before people look at it. I think it's like multiple hundreds of repositories of like random things. But I also run a blog at arakadata.com where I always do a write-up of all the projects that I work on, these side projects. So if anybody's interested, check it out.
Yeah, I'm like, okay, I'm trying to remember what your blog is, because I've definitely gone to it. Oh, there it is. I've gone to it because I remember the change data capture. Let's see, I'll just put it in the comments if anyone's interested. So that way they have it. It won't go to LinkedIn because for some reason the StreamYard can't post comments to LinkedIn, but it'll go to YouTube. So that makes sense. Here's a question. I mean, how important are degrees in getting hired? Is it demonstrating the skills in a portfolio enough?
Oh, well, I get hired, I think, like 5 times now, or 6 times throughout my career at different companies, and I do not have a degree. So in my personal experience, it's not as important. Yeah, I mean, I started it, but never actually finished. And in all of the processes, the hiring processes that I went through, it was never an issue. So yeah, I don't think it's that important. I as a hiring manager, I usually don't really care about the degree either. I would much rather prefer someone having either experience or some projects that they build themselves.
Yeah. I think the one counter I have there is when I was at my first job, I was hired as an intern. They literally said they couldn't hire me, and maybe this was a good way of keeping me and not having to pay me as much until they could go to my university website and find like, because they could like search up your degree. And they're like, yeah, until that happens, we cannot officially hire you. I think it was more from a bureaucratic standpoint, like they're an older company, they have to have a degree. But imagine newer companies, yeah, I'm sure there's like, it's not like a have to as much.
Yeah, not at all, thankfully.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I would have to go back to school.
Yeah, and like it's funny because like, I mean, 80% of my classes had nothing to do with software, I think, or maybe it was like 70%, right? Like some of it was like creative writing, and I enjoyed the classes; they were fun, but definitely didn't help me as much technically. And nowadays, there's so much like information. Like people at 16 could probably learn all of this, and by 18 be a better data engineer than, you know, a good portion of the people that go to college for like a software background, because it'd be much more focused. It'd be a little more specialized in that specific area.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of fundamental things that actually are missing from university courses. Like I've met a lot of like fresh graduates who never used version control, for example.
Yeah,
and
that's always. I was gonna say is a Git, because that's always what everyone says. Like Git's always one of those standouts.
Yeah, so it just happens so often that they go through like 3, 4, 5 years of grueling maths and other courses, and most of that is not usable in an enterprise setting.
Yeah, it's funny because I've just run into that issue a lot where people are like, yeah, I've never had to use Git, which would seem like such an obvious thing, and I don't think I had to in school either, but it would seem like such an obvious thing. It's like, yeah, like just make it part of the curriculum. Like as you're building these projects, if anything, like the whole CS program should just be around that, right? Like you should just be like, day one of CS, make a GitHub account, or if you don't like GitHub, sure, pick something else. And that should just be day one. And then from there, you go and have a whole portfolio by the end of your time at school.
Yeah, exactly.
And it'd be cooler because hopefully then you'd get different projects too. Because like part of it, I think, would be like build a project that doesn't exist, or you're not like just doing another to-do app for the 10,000th time. I saw a tweet recently from the Primogen where he was like, I've done 10,000 hours of building to-do apps. I'm ready for my interviews. And it's like, yeah, that is kind of how we treat it sometimes. Where it's like, we'll just keep building the same project over and over again, and we'll get better.
I wonder what's the data engineering equivalent of a to-do app.
Stock market, something, or Twitter data feed pull or something like that. I mean,
the Twitter data was, but they made it not free. So I think we have to come up with a new one. Yeah.
Yes. Well, it could be Darshill's project. And I'm only saying this because he's got like he's got over 500,000 views. So it just means like lots of people have seen it. So I imagine lots of people have made that exact project. Hopefully they've made it. And now it'll probably be like Zach Wilson's NBA data set will be the next big thing. I was like, everyone's done an NBA.
Probably,
yeah. So let's see. Do DEs need to have a high level of DSA skills to attend interviews and better career opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, so for attending interviews, I think it depends on the companies that you're targeting. There are companies where the DE interview is essentially equivalent to the software engineering interview. Like big tech companies, as far as I know, are like this for some extent. But for the actual job itself, it's not that much of a requirement. Like even though you deal a lot with data, it's such a subset. The data structures that you actually deal with are such a subset of the DSA curriculum that you don't have to implement algorithms yourself usually, and you don't have to implement data structures either. So for interviewing, I would say go for it and learn it as much as you can. But don't expect your career to be centered around DSA.
Yeah, I mean, in a weird way, it is centered around DSA. It's just all abstracted away from you. It's all in the database. It's like a lot, whatever data structures and algorithms do exist. A lot of it's going to be in the database. It's going to be hidden away from you. You're just writing SQL on top of it and having you interact with it. And then I mean, even like I did a whole article recently talking about joins, and I think I lightly referenced like the big O notation of different joins, but it's like, but that's the thing. You're not gonna generally have to know too much about it. It's good to know. I think it's one, interesting, and two, sometimes you do have to kind of improve performance by knowing which joins are kind of being used. But in terms of like actual skills, it's not as necessary as Daniel said. Like, figure out where you're interviewing and if they ask those questions. Facebook, this was at this point now like 4 or 5 years ago, didn't. They asked like some more operational questions, and then one kind of data structure kind of question where you had to like, I want to say, I use like a keyword stack, and I'm spacing on which one to like pop out different what do you call it, brackets. But Amazon, when I did Amazon, there was no Python. It was like all SQL or database design. And so you really have to figure out which company you're going to.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's see. Well, only because someone asked, like, how do you see, like, do you see anything with DLT, Dexter together? Do you see any projects with that? It's a very specific niche question. Like, I don't know. These are still new tools. I'm sure there's someone somewhere using it, but
yeah. I mean, Dexter is a Python framework for data orchestration or data pipeline orchestration, and DLT is a Python framework for data pipelines. So I can definitely see where the two intersect. I have not seen actually the two used together so far, but yeah, I can see it happening. I mean, I like both, so yeah, why not?
It's hard right now because there's so many tools. I think that's like the biggest challenge is it feels like there's so many options, and it feels like so many are trying to improve upon what was. But we're also at a point where companies are still like, Airflow is still probably the most common open source like workflow orchestration tool that exists. At least every time I do any form of poll or anything or talk to people, Airflow is still just there, and SSIS is still everywhere. I mean, I wrote a few articles about SSIS, and they're probably the ones that get clicked on the most because everyone's still using it. So yeah.
I think the most important is to learn the fundamentals for new data engineers. Like, essentially what you want to achieve with all of these frameworks and all of these data pipelines is to have a set of transformations that you execute in order, and they depend on each other. And everything else is just sugar, like how you handle if something fails, how you handle backfills, like all of that is just like the necessary things that come with it. But the core of a data pipeline is just data transformations that you have to run after another. So whatever tool you choose, Airflow, Dexter, the problem is going to be the same. The solution is going to look a little bit different.
Yeah. And you guys are all lucky on backfills. Because I remember like sometimes for some companies I've worked with, the backfill was like a process where it was like, all right, now go through this run book. Step 1, delete the data from the old, because like you don't have this in a pipeline. It's just like delete the old data in the whatever table. Step 2, now run this statement. Step 3, now run this statement. Now you can rerun the pipeline. Whereas nowadays it's just like, click on your Airflow job, say clear out all the tasks before it, and rerun it.
If whatever you use has a backfill button, then consider yourself lucky.
I will say, like, there were a few times I had to backfill at Facebook, and it would just be like, oh, it's going to run like 5,000 tasks, and somewhere it's going to fail, and I'm going to have to go figure out where one of those tasks failed and rerun it somewhere, because I had to rerun for like a year or something, and that would always be kind of painful. But yes. Oh man, it's fun. All right, well, we're kind of we're at time. We're at about 10. Hopefully everyone's asked the questions they wanted. I hope you've learned a little bit about the pains of data pipelines and some of the decisions you have to make as you're doing it. We talked a little bit about tooling, but I don't know, Danny, any other questions, any other thoughts?
Nothing that comes to my mind. I really I was surprised by the question of people, or how many people asked about going into data engineering, but I'm happy to see that there's still a lot of interest. And I would just like to reiterate that it's still a great time to jump into data engineering if you're thinking about it. And hit up a book, start a course. It's a fun time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, I think what is it at right now? The data engineering subreddit has grown so much. What is it at? Let's see, data
Yeah, it's
engineering.
like 200 something thousand.
Yeah, I think
It's
yeah,
crazy.
231,000. Like when I started, I want to say it was probably at like 60 or 50, or it was so small. And now I was like, because for a while there I was like, oh man, I'm kind of tracking like the number of subscribers I have on YouTube is very similar to like the subreddit. So I must have a good portion of the market. But now it's so much larger, and it's just gotten so much bigger. So it's really cool to see.
Yeah, it's definitely nice to see, and there's still more room to grow.
Yes, yeah. I mean, and I like to tell people like at this point, like I said, you've got the streaming side. I think the other point we'll see is like unstructured data will become more and more of a thing where people just want more context. That's what's kind of happened in my world, or what I've seen is like when you first started, you had like very basic transaction information, and that was like all you had. So you can only kind of tell like, okay, someone bought a product. We don't know much about this person, but we can kind of tell that they bought a product and they buy a product every so often. And then suddenly they're like, yeah, but let's also like add in all this other data. We can add in more context. We can either pull in data from other data sets or partner with a different company and really start joining all this data together. And I imagine the same thing is going to happen with like unstructured data. I always think of like shopping data, or like shopping. If you go to like a shopping center, people will probably want to track that data and be like, how does this customer go into our stores? Can we track them? Because that's something that they've never had like in person. Like e-commerce has had it. They can track you as you go through their store and see what you click on, what you don't buy. But I imagine retailers will eventually want more of that information as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Cool. Well, we're past time, so I want to make sure you get to, if you have another meeting, you get to it. So thanks again, Danny. Thanks everyone for joining. Any final thoughts?
Nothing. Thank you so much.
Perfect.
It was a joy.
Awesome. I'm gonna hit end stream.